Hello guys, in this video we'll be looking at how to start working with CSS Grid. Specifically, we'll be looking at the grid property and how it affects our layout. We'll also be looking at grid template columns. We'll be adding spaces to our grid cells. And finally, we'll be looking at how to span our content across the grid. Let's take a look. Okay, so for this, you'll need some understanding of React and JavaScript, but I did my best to hide all the context away from this page or from this code and allow us to focus on the div elements or the HTML and the CSS that we'll be working with to form our final product. For this example, our product would be something like this. You can think of it as a device replacement window. If your phone got lost or stolen, you file a claim, and then at the end, you get to a page like this. And this is a layout that we'll be recreating. So if we go back and look at the HTML code, that's exactly what we see. We see a div wrapped around image component. We'll also see a device description component and a device deductible container, which is holding the deductible description for our layout. But on the outer div or the outer element, we see there is a replacement container wrapping all of our content. And this is the first class name or first class that we'll be looking at and we'll be working with, because it holds all the items or all the elements that we are interested in and that we want to form a layout for. So let's start by adding a display grid to it. So if you go do display grid, we'll see how CSS Grid tries its best to form a grid out of the content that we already have. Go back to app.js, we have an image, device description, and a device deductible. And what CSS Grid is trying to do is forming a grid out of those three div elements. And the way it's doing it is by placing each one of those div elements in a row. So as you can see, we have 1 to 2 will be forming row 1, which holds the image. 2 to 3 is forming row 2, and that's holding the device description. 3 to 4 is holding device deductible. It's important to notice how CSS Grid counts the rows, because we'll use that later for spanning our content across a grid. Let's go back to style CSS and add another column. So we already added display grid. CSS did its best to create a grid based on the information it has so far, but now we can add more data to it by adding another column to our grid. And for that, we'll need grid template columns. And the way grid template columns work is by allowing us to add a size for each column separated by a space. And what we'll do here is add one fraction for each column. So we'll do 1fr space 1fr. That will tell CSS Grid to add 2 columns. Each of them will be a fraction wide, and it'll again do its best to fit our content within those 2 columns. Now we see that there is the device description here, and it's very close to the first column, device description on the second column here. What we'll need here to separate a little bit our content, and it looks more like what we're looking for over here, would be to add a gap. So here we can do grid gap, and we can do 20 pixels here, and we'll see how it'll add a gap across the board for rows and columns. But in this case, we're only looking for adding a grid gap to our column. So it'll be a grid gap between column 1 and 2. And for that, we'll do grid column gap, 20 pixels, and there you have it. We'll have a gap of 20 pixels right in the middle of our two columns. Now, we also see that the device image is not taking 100% of the real estate here of its one fraction or its fraction. So we see that this one here, the space for this column here is taking the entire fraction, but the image doesn't need that much space. It just needs to fill the column with the space that it needs for the image. In that case, we can tell CSS Grid to add auto, and what it'll do is just to fix the size of our column based on the content inside it. In this case, the biggest content or the larger content is our image here. So it's taking the space necessary to fit that image, and then it's leaving the rest for our second column, which is where our device description sits. So we want our device image to span across the first column. Right now we have the deductible information here, but in reality we want device description and deductible description to be on the same side of the column, and then our device image will be spanning from the first row to the second row. So in reality what we're trying to do is making our image to span from row 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. And for that, we'll need to look at our device image and apply some properties to it, so CSS Grid can understand what to do with that image. And what we're gonna do here is to add a grid row. We're gonna manipulate the row for that image and tell CSS Grid to span across the first row all the way to the third row. And for that, we'll need to do 1/3. Now, as you can see, CSS Grid automatically makes our image span across the first row and the second row, and it pushes deductible description to the right side or to the second column, leaving us with something that looks closer to our final product. But what's remaining here is to fix our deductible description section. If we look at our final product, it looks like deductible description, it's all one row with the word deductible, the amount of $100, and all the way at the end, the Y link over here. So if we go back to our code, we see that the deductible, the amount, and the Y, they're all in a row. So what we can do here is create a grid within a grid. So what we can do is take that class or that div and convert it into a grid. So in that case, we'll be looking at the main replacement container being a grid, but then we'll have another element inside our replacement container also acting as a grid, and in this case would be the device deductible section. So if we do device deductible and apply a grid to it, display grid, we'll also be creating a grid inside our grid for the deductible section. So if we apply more properties to it, so we can also lay out that section inside that cell with similar properties. We can do grid template columns. We'll only need one row. So as we can see with the first example of the replacement container, as soon as we added the display grid, CSS Grid applied one column for everything and one row for each one of the divs. In this case, we're adding display grid. It will try to do the same with the device deductible section, and we'll need 3 columns, one for deductible, one for the amount, and one for the Y. All of them can be the same size. So they can be 1FR, 1FR, and 1FR. And you can see that they all fit within the same row and 3 different columns. But instead of doing 1FR, 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 another syntax that we can use here would be repeat, or another function that we can use would be repeat, where we'll tell grid to repeat our command 3 times. And in this case, it'll be 1FR for each one of the columns. We only have 1 row and 3 columns, 1 for each one of the divs inside that device deductible element. And there we have it. That's all we have for how to start working with CSS Grid, how to apply a display grid to our layout, how to add template columns, how to add some gap to our columns or to our grid cells. And also, really important, we learned how to span our content across our grid rows. So that's it. I hope you learned some foundational knowledge on how to start working with CSS Grid. And with this basic knowledge, you can keep expanding on how to add more responsiveness and how to work with your layouts on your applications. I'll see you in the next one.